and I'll start off by giving you my background. So, testing 1, 2, 3.
We're off.
Look, I've been a veterinarian for pretty close to 40 years. I've been principally involved in equine practice in that time. And although a lot of people wouldn't think so, I'm just not at the cutting edge of the treating vet, racetrack vet sort of profile. In fact, I'm very skeptical about a lot of that stuff. And my passion is much more with the science and the objectivity of it. And I think over time I've observed a lot of my training clients and others being overwhelmed by their lack of information and a fairly aggressive regime that they work under. And, you know, by the same token, I appreciate the stewards have got to keep them under control, and there's some bad eggs amongst them. But now that I've withdrawn from my veterinary practice, I've become very much more involved in you know, just basically championing the science and the truth and trying to get a little bit of balance in there. And it doesn't always earn me a lot of goodwill with the racing authorities, but that's just the price I pay. I might add that I did dabble in horse training. I've been a horse rider all my life, and I've competitively ridden in equestrian sports. And I did have an owner-trainer's license 25 years ago, and so I've been on that side of the fence as well. So I've got some affinities with trainers, but I'm certainly not sort of fly around the stables treating up horses, pre-race drip sort of veterinarian. In fact, I'm a little bit sceptical of a lot of that business. And I think the poor trainers out there to win races, isn't he? And they don't always know all about everything, as you've just intimated. You don't know all about Cobalt, and they're very easily led along by basically the treatment industry, the pharmaceutical and additives industry, and some aspects of the veterinary profession. And they have an understandable sort of concern that if they're not at the edge of this, they mightn't be winning the races. I understand all that. And that sort of, unfortunately, I think plays into the hands of the administrators sometimes and gets them into trouble. And likewise, the administrators, I think, get this perception that every trainer's out there trying to beat them all the time. And so they get an understandable, almost paranoia about it as well. And I think that they bring the analytical laboratories on board with them too. So that's where you come in, and this sensitive analysis thing, I think, is a very interesting and important topic. So there's my background. Does that get you started?
Yeah, definitely. How have you been included within, I suppose you could say it's been dubbed a saga now because it's been going on for so long, but how has your inclusion within this come about? You said you're hired on behalf of the trainers, but you're not. I was talking to Ross.
Yeah, I suppose I probably should tell a little bit more about my background. I was very involved in the veterinary profession, and in fact was the president of the Australian Equine Veterinary Association in the year 1999 to 2000. And I actually wrote an editorial in our journal saying that I think we needed exactly what you're talking about now, some transparency in drug testing, and we needed to be looking at some thresholds and deciding what was, you know, a fair place to actually call a drug a positive in a day and age where there's no such thing as a negative, everything's a drop in the ocean. And I guess my editorial was a reflection upon the fact that even in my career as a veterinarian, the good luck to them and all credit to them, the analysts have got very much more sophisticated in what they can detect. And as I've intimated, it wasn't my job to try to buck the system, but when I started out in practice, it was common knowledge that a lot of fairly potent pharmaceuticals were not detectable. And things that we might think are second nature now, like corticosteroids, dexamethasone, clenbuterol, things like that, were simply not testable. So there had to be a fair bit of secrecy about what they could find and the sophistication of drug testing and so on. And I think that that's carried on into an era where really the analysts are extremely good at detecting minuscule amounts of substances, and I'm talking about nanograms and picograms, so billionths and I think I call it trillionths of grams, whereas when I started out, they probably don't like me saying so, some of the testing was a little bit akin to sticking a bit of blotting paper in something and watching the sample rise up the blotting paper. And so I think the analysts really have definitely come of age now and are very, very good at detecting pharmaceuticals. And I think one of the messages trainers should know that if they've got something which they think is going to be therapeutically active in a horse, the analysts are going to find it. And that the goalposts have changed an awful lot in my career in that regard. And it also gets to the stage where I think we need to know a little bit about what they are finding and at what level. And so I've got a business now called Derek Major Consulting. It's only a small key endeavour, and it's just my opportunity to explore some of these things. And inevitably, I find myself in stewards' inquiries and tribunals and so on, where trainers think they've been aggrieved. And the first thing I'd like to say is that I'm not about getting murderers out of jail, and I don't ever go into bat for somebody that everybody knows they've actually cheated and they're trying to get out. I believe the people I'm working for have got a genuine case, and my role is to actually be an advocate for the science. I'm not an advocate for the party. I've never met most of these people. In fact, I never meet most of them. I have some telephone calls with them. But really, all I'm interested in is making sure the science gets a good hearing, and hopefully I enable the justice to prevail.
So when you're talking about, obviously you've said that previously they couldn't test for everything. So what they could test for, they needed to be quiet about it so people couldn't dodge or essentially administer things that weren't able to be tested by the authorities. But that's now changed with the ability to, with better tests. How have the implementation of new tests and better testing actually affected the positives that people have been getting? I mean, how have you seen those new tests and how I suppose sensitive they are? Has it been any sort of real negative sort of side effects of that you can think of off the top of your head?
Well, I think it works both ways. I'm quite gratified to know that some of the I won't take all the credit for it, but some of the suggestions that I outlined in my editorial in the year 2000 have now actually been adopted as policy by the Australian Racing Board. And there is a document entitled Screening Limits Policy, where they've put it out in writing that they will screen for certain common and necessary therapeutics at a certain level. And in other words, if they find a very small concentrate which couldn't possibly be active in the horse at the time of racing, they won't bring it up. So, and I think that's a very fair outcome. And in fact, I've actually sent you some documents. I don't know if you've seen them. I've sent you a bundle of documents, and one of them is the Screening Limits Policy. And in association with the veterinary profession, they made a priority of actually determining some excretion times and so on for these products, to work out a time when veterinarians and trainers could look after the best welfare and interests of the horse and yet not compromise the rules of racing. Now, I can't remember just exactly how many substances are listed on there. It's of the order of probably 20 or so, and that's harmonised with all the international racing authorities, so they're all working to the same goalposts. And that lets us give some objective information out to trainers about how to do the right thing. So that's been a very positive thing, and I applaud them for it. And I'm gratified that it's a seed that I sowed some years earlier. Of course, the negative side to that is that there are some substances which are used legitimately as therapies which are not on that list, and so they're deemed to have a zero level. So if a good new analytical instrument in the laboratories can find things at an even smaller level than before, there's a risk that all of a sudden that'll come up as a positive. And in their defence, the laboratories would say we keep a watchful eye on that and we set our own in-house limits and so on. But that's not very transparent, and I'm worried that we're giving the laboratories a role which is not really theirs. I think their laboratory should be to get very, very good at testing, and then there should be an independent form of scientific review about what's called a positive. And that doesn't happen to my knowledge in racing. I don't know whether you've delved into the rules, but if you look, it seems to follow a train where if the analyst reports are positive, the stewards must disqualify the horse and must penalise the trainer. And there's not really a lot of scope for anybody to say whether that was the amount of substance they detected was, as we call it, a drop in the ocean, or in fact an attempt to cheat the system.
How small, when you're talking about micrograms? I mean, a picogram, is that the equivalent of 1 grain of salt in an Olympic-sized swimming pool? Would that be the equivalent of a picogram when you're saying?
I haven't done the sums, but if every time you get a new number, you take things down by 1,000. So if you go from a gram to a milligram to a microgram to a nanogram to a picogram, you're dividing by 1,000 every single time. So by the time you're getting to a picogram, it's not very much. I think from memory, if you're comparing a nanogram with a gram, you're comparing 1 second in about 35 years. So you're talking about tiny, tiny amounts. I was involved in a cocaine matter, and I won't say when or where or even what code it was in, but the amount detected was about 1/3 of a nanogram. And I found a paper where they found levels higher than that in something like 70% of American dollar bills. So, obviously you're not going to, there's environmental contamination. And that sort of level wasn't going to make the animal run any faster or slower. Yet it was detectable. There's a zero tolerance to cocaine legitimately in horses and dogs, and so that case was prosecuted. I'm also interested in the fact that there's an Australian workplace health and safety standard, and drugs are tested under an international standard, in fact, Australian Standard 4308. And they publish cut-offs for substances, and these are the substances of abuse, such as cannabis and amphetamines and cocaine and things. And they simply don't report amounts of less than a certain number of nanograms. And most of the drugs that are found in racing, there are no such limits. So anything is regarded as a positive.
Really?
And I think as they get better and better at finding small amounts, there is the risk that they will detect insignificant residues.
Because when you're talking in picograms, I've heard, I mean, the only sort of background I have with an understanding of any of that is the MMA fighter, I think it was John Jones, he tested a positive coming up into one of his fights and had to be relocated from Vegas to another place. And they were saying some of those readings where the instruments are getting that sensitive that essentially someone could even open up a supplement in the room that happened to be either just contaminated with a banned substance, and breathing that in could actually give you a positive within one of your tests. I mean, with tests getting so much more sensitive, are you pretty much suggesting that there should be a not necessarily a threshold, but as you said, a level that should be detected, that anything under that is considered a negative to that test?
I believe that is a scientific reality, and all credit to them, they're getting to the stage where they can detect tiny amounts of substances. And I think if they find a tiny amount of substances, I don't think the racing public would countenance the idea that a racehorse raced with any cocaine or any ice in it or any opioids in it. But the reality is that they don't also want the situation where if, say, somebody sneezed that had snorted some cocaine, the horse could yield a positive, which was of no consequence to it. So it's a scientific reality that there's no such thing as zero. So there'll be another side to this story, and I'm quite sure there'll be people in the racing administration that will argue violently with what I'm saying. But I believe that the issue is, and the way I see it, there's really no scope for any at least transparent assessment of whether a level found was of importance. And the steward's job, they will say their job is they're like policemen with a speeding ticket. If you go faster than 80, you've broken the rules. They're not there to say whether you were driving safely or anything. So there doesn't seem to me to be any real scope for any scientific interpretation of the findings between an analyst who, if they take any pride in their work, they want to be able to detect smaller and smaller and smaller quantities of things. They then pass the information straight through to the stewards, who have absolutely no choice. It's not optional for them. The rule says they must disqualify the horse and they must prosecute the trainer.
Yeah, exactly. How have you seen?
You might have your own view on this as a trainer and a person involved in racing. And
yeah, I mean, I was the main thing that I was always curious about regarding this is the fact it's been going for so long. Not many people actually understand what the drug is. The fact that there's been limited tests to even understand what it does, at what level is needed, and if it actually is confirmed to be any sort of performance enhancing thing. And the fact that also mainly is that if anyone gets a positive, they're pretty much seen as doing the wrong thing no matter what. So there's actually surprising how little tests there have been done or studies have been done to actually understand if any of these substances do increase performance, how much and how much is needed. I mean, it just pretty much seems like there's been a threshold or a drug that's been listed that shouldn't be administered. And it's actually effects and the amount that's needed to give a positive effect are not even understood. And I think that's the biggest thing that I've sort of been figuring out and seeing is that people can get a positive without doing anything wrong as far as administration. And the basis of these drugs and why they're being put on as a banned substance haven't necessarily been tested rigorously enough to even understand what their effects are within the body and how they react at different times.
Yeah, I think in defence of the racing authorities, I don't think they should need to or could possibly be expected to have to prove that every substance they find did or could affect the performance of that horse on that occasion. I don't think that's a realistic ask, and I don't think they should. But we have to work off the best scientific information available. And I think you've alluded to the Cobalt situation, and I think it grew out of some hysteria and some trackside mythology, which I believe evolved out of the cycling sport. And a professor of hematology in Italy puts a proposal out in an editorial that maybe cyclists might abuse Cobalt. I don't believe there was any good science behind that. And if you look at it now, there's daylight between what even could possibly affect a horse or a cyclist's performance and the sort of levels that they're testing for in urine and in blood in athletes. And it's absolute daylight. And in fact, because it's been such a big issue around the world, there has now been some fairly good research conducted and published in the journals. And again, it highlights that there is daylight between what even could possibly affect performance. And in fact, all the studies have found no effect on, say, red cell count and aerobic capacity and so on. And between that sort of level and the levels that are being picked up in racehorses and trainers being prosecuted for. So one study, they had horses and they achieved urine levels of up to about 90,000 and found really nothing happened. Certainly the horses didn't like it when it was put in a big hurry, but nobody's ever suggesting anybody's done that. But the levels that they achieved in blood and urine were just so different from the thresholds we've got in racing that there's chalk and cheese. And even at that level, they found that it didn't stimulate erythropoietin or red cell production or other markers of oxidative metabolism. So that's the issue we face. We can't go and do that for every possible drug, but the whole mythology behind cobalt, I think, has been vastly exaggerated, and it's given it a folklore status, sort of like kryptonite, and really it's very little different from any other trace metal, nickel or zinc or anything else that horses need to survive.
What has your involvement been with regarding the different cobalt cases? People have called you in to get your expert opinion. What has roughly, without giving any specifics on individual cases, what has been the information that you've provided different hearings on behalf of the trainers? What has been the basis of what you've said?
Look, my short summation of the cobalt situation, which has unwound over the last 5 or 6 years, is that undoubtedly some unscrupulous trainers meddled with cobalt infusions into the vein, and anecdotally they were giving, I think, 500 milligram of cobalt into the vein, and it was ill-advised in my view, and it really no prospect it would actually have any effect on performance. And I'm sure it had unpleasant effects as it was dripped in rapidly. As when you inject just about anything in rapidly, you run the risk of short-term adverse effects. But the authorities caught up with that, and I believe that practice is all done and dusted, and what we're seeing now, there's something like 350 positive cases that I have logged in the 3 racing codes around Australia. I would say the very vast majority of them are inadvertent positives from environmental, feed or supplement contamination, and of no real consequence.
Have you had much experience with other countries that have had cobalt positives? I mean, is there a country or a racing code that you would base maybe Australia's approach, or say Australia's approach should look to follow, that you think is a good yardstick going forward?
Well, North America, I believe, is where it all started. And the North Americans, or when I say the North Americans, United States, Canada's tended to follow the Commonwealth countries. But in the United States, they tended to move more towards testing for blood, and they set a threshold of, or 2 thresholds really, of 25 and 50. At 25, they exercised some sanctions, and at 50, they added some more in. And without having researched it in great detail, it appears to me that the Americans have very rapidly got a handle on the practice, and this is reflected in their studies, where the surveys they've done on blood cobalts have just skyrocketed downwards since they put the rule in, and I don't believe it's causing them a great deal of trouble. I'm aware that in some of the Commonwealth countries, South Africa, New Zealand and the United Kingdom, they have adopted the urine threshold. I believe the way they've managed those cases in those countries have been a lot more moderate, and I'm not aware that they've had a big drama in those countries either. And I don't think it's just because Australia is a nation of cheats. I've been openly critical about the actual urine threshold. I think it's the wrong substance. I think they should be measuring blood, because blood's where it's really doing its job. And if you look in human studies, and blood is very much the preferred medium for determining actual cobalt, total cobalt levels in a horse, and urine comes and goes and so on. And I think that we're getting a lot of, the majority of the positives we're getting now, I believe, are vitamin administration, cobalt in feed, and even environment, and nothing to do with doping, horse doping, and of no consequence to the horse's welfare, and of no consequence to its performance.
On that, do you think that it's practical for maybe a racing authority to bring out a list of third-party tested and approved supplements and feeds that, if the trainer can prove they're using, and they do happen to get over the threshold of something like a cobalt, that then they've automatically got a pass or they're looked at far more favourably than someone that's just been going on the threshold and then initially has to go and try and find what they've given that could possibly put them over that?
I can understand the authorities' reluctance to open racing up to third-party providers and so on. And yet they're a little bit in the dark, or they're very much in the dark, and they don't really have any means of determining these things. And I think we're probably putting Cobalt on a pedestal. It's really just not that important. I think it would be more prudent to just get more advice and information out there to leave it alone. I personally think that Cobalt containing injectables probably have seen their day. I think it's best that we just don't do it, because Cobalt injections can't even be utilised by the horse, and there's certainly cause for some of the problems they've got, not all the problems, but some of the problems have been legitimate, registered Cobalt-containing vitamin supplements. So rather than show the trainers where they can test their levels, I'd rather suggest to them, educate them into saying, well, just steer away from it, and it'll help you get out of trouble. And one thing I don't want trainers doing on both sides of the fence, I don't want them thinking that we've got to get a certain amount of Cobalt in to win races, because that's just not true at all. So I'm not really in favour of saying, here's some labs where you can get independent testing done. Although I do question when Racing New South Wales put out a statement after the Ron Quinton affair that trainers should establish the Cobalt level in the feed before they feed it. I'm not quite sure how they're expected to do that.
Should the race? I mean, I think in Hong Kong they approve what feed can be brought in, and what supplements can be used. I mean, as I said before, should the racing authorities have a list of their own that they suggest trainers can use that they are confident don't contain anything that's a banned substance under their rules, or is that just not practical?
I don't think it's practical or desirable, and this has come up in other contexts where Hong Kong's a very regulated racing industry, and I don't think it's appropriate to Australian circumstances. And I should stress that Cobalt is an essential trace nutrient, and I think it's quite in order for feed manufacturers to put trace amounts of Cobalt in the feed, as they do with a number of other trace minerals and even the macro elements as well. That's what supplements are all about. And I don't think we want the racing industry dictating to trainers and feed manufacturers what they can and can't put in feeds. I don't think that's their role. And I think we're, again, jumping at shadows. We've put Cobalt on a pedestal that it shouldn't be on. And I don't think racing authorities should be there trying to sort of analyse feedstuffs and tell trainers how to feed their horses. I think that's not their job. It's not their expertise.
What do you see? What steps do you see the authorities taking now?
I've been a signatory to a letter that a number of independent experts have written to the racing authorities. I think in that letter we've asked for a review, an independent scientific review, so that independent people from all sides of the fence can get together and talk about this and decide the way forward. I've openly suggested that I don't think urine is the right test medium. I would like to see them go to a blood test. I would like to see more public education along the lines that I've just discussed with you about leaving Cobalt injections out of the routine, because they're not even useful to the horse. I don't think, given the sort of profile that Cobalt's got now, I don't think we can just drop off and say we're not going to worry about it anymore, because I have sat alongside of trainers, and I've been a trainer for 40 years, and as soon as the rule was relaxed, some trainers would think, well, I think we better try a little bit of it. So I'm much more on the public education than throwing the rule away. But I think we have to acknowledge that there is a serious risk with the current urine threshold that will catch completely innocent people in the net. So I'd prefer to see us go to blood testing and also review the penalty situation. I think if we got a positive in a urine, that might be an indication for further examination of the trainer's practices, feeding practices, training practices, perhaps even do some blood profiling on the trainer. But I think the idea of disqualifying or suspending a trainer for between 1 and 10 years or more is fairly harsh, given that it could be a completely innocent positive.
Do you see that as something that could be looked at again? I mean, if trainers have had their livelihood taken away from them, I suppose, as a result of a positive, and the basis of these positives could possibly even be seen as a false reading, how does that look going forwards as far as liability for different actors in that? I mean, would a racing authority then look to be possibly I don't know, liable for costing money to an individual when the basis of their findings were flawed?
I think you need to ask a lawyer that. I'm not a lawyer. I provide the science.
Yep.
I do. It appears to me that we do have some issues, I think, with the way we deal with Cobalt offences, and the disciplinary hierarchy doesn't really lend itself to investigation of the science terribly well. As I mentioned already, the stewards are obliged under the rules of racing to prosecute. Their job is not there to actually determine the science, and the trainer doesn't really get an opportunity to escalate his case up into an area where these things can be legitimately pursued. For a number of reasons, for time constraints, for financial constraints, and these things tend to sort of wear themselves out before they ever get to a level where the higher courts can consider it. And it's interesting to me that in each case the adjudicator looks and sees what they gave the last 5 or 10 Cobalt cases and benchmarks the sentence against that. Whereas if they worked outside of Cobalt on some of the other pharmaceuticals, there seems to be a different penalty scale. But again, I'm the scientist involved in this. I'm not the lawyer. But a lot of people would say that there's a completely different penalty scale once you work within the walls of a Cobalt case from everything else in racing. So that's something for consideration, I think.
So the penalties for positive of Cobalt tend to be far worse than for other drugs or things that have been tested positive within a horse. Yeah.
Yeah, you probably do your own research there, but I think you mentioned that we're taking away a trainer's livelihood and stepping outside of my role, but taking away someone's livelihood is a very serious step to take, and I would be concerned that a trainer's livelihood was removed from an issue which really didn't actually affect the performance of a horse and was really no fault of his own.
Why have you seen this dragging on for so long? I mean, it seems like it's been in the news. Like you said, the rule was brought in, 2014? You had 2015 with that major case of Moody Kavanagh and O'Brien, and it's still here, and it's still getting talked about, if not more so regularly now than over the last couple of years. I mean, why is it? How come this in particular seems to be something that's taken so much longer compared to anything else that seems to be popping up within this industry? What seems to be the factor regarding Cobalt that has let it continue on the way it has?
I think you can make your own speculation about that. It's obviously a difficult dilemma for all concerned. There's cases that have just dragged, even the actual initial stewards' inquiries have dragged on for some years. It clearly creates difficulties. Going back in my career as a veterinarian for 40 years, there's something a little bit different about Cobalt from other drug offences I've worked with. In general, the trainers can point to what happened or something was given a little close to racing, or something was two feeds were mixed up. There seem to be other clear pathways, and I think with some of these Cobalt ones in general, they've really got no idea what happened. And I also suspect that their resilience, the fact that they fight these things, is testament to the fact that they really don't feel they've done anything wrong. That's a little bit different in my experience from most of the other drug issues I've dealt with in my career. I also feel that it's somewhat unusual that 5 years after a substance is declared to be prohibited, this number of positives are still coming up. If we look back through the history of racing, things like, you can point to elephant juice and caffeine, and even go back to phenylbutazone and clenbuterol and so on, you don't very often see positives to substances once they're declared to be prohibited, and it's common knowledge that they're detectable. That's usually the end of that. And the Cobalt cases still seem to keep cropping up, which is certainly unusual.
Yeah, very true, which is probably a bit of a testament to, as you mentioned before, how hard it is to actually gauge where these things are coming from, and the fact it's always present in the environment to a certain degree, I guess.
Yeah, and the overwhelming surprise that these trainers expressed to me is also a little bit unfamiliar to me. And I've been around for 40 years, so I've seen most things happen, and mostly the trainers with other substances can give you some lead on how it might have happened. And these Cobalt cases in general, they come to me and they've really got no idea what's happened.
Yeah, it's a bit more education on what this actually is, and where it can actually be ingested by the horse, I guess. How come these readings are getting over the threshold? And dehydration has been said to be one of the reasons why, Ross Wenzel said that even dehydration can put the readings up tenfold within urine, as compared to a hydrated horse. I mean, I suppose obviously, yeah, a lot more education needs to be done. I mean, what?
I think even the issue you raised there about dehydration is a source of misunderstanding, and I have intended inquiries where it's been expressed the view that that if they were dehydrated they wouldn't have won the race, and long before the horse is actually clinically dehydrated to the extent it's not performing, a horse on a hot day that's been on a truck or perhaps had the water turned off first thing in the morning is going to conserve water. So the horse will be absolutely 100% in itself, but the message comes through the kidneys, retain water. So I agree with what Ross Wenzel has obviously shared with you, that there's wide variation in urine levels of Cobalt for the same exposure, just dependent on the watery environment and the daily temperature and the sweating and the drinking pattern of the horse. So one thing that I know Mr. Wenzel advocates is that urine be corrected. The actual Cobalt level is corrected for the actual concentration of the urine, which is standard practice in his laboratory. So that's one source of variation. But again, I don't think eliminating that effect will solve all our Cobalt problems. I think the correct test we should be using is blood, not urine anyway.
Yeah, very true. Excellent. Do you have anything else to add of what you've found regarding this subject, or I suppose prohibited substances in racing going forward? You said it's a little bit clouded or a little bit untransparent with what's been tested, how they're being tested for, and what amount is coming back as a positive, and there should be possibly more transparency in the tests and how it's undertaken. Could you share a bit more on that, on what your thoughts are there?
I guess that takes me back to the discussions I've had about these trace levels of illicit substances. And I guess an example that I could share with you is that I've been involved in a couple of cases where ketamine has turned up in a horse's urine. And of course, at first blush, that seems like a terrible idea. Ketamine is a party drug, and they call it Special K, and it's a S8 pharmaceutical, and it seems abhorrent to think that it's in a horse. But when you look into it a little more deeply, it's actually a general anaesthetic. So it doesn't really seem like people would want to give a horse a general anaesthetic to win a race. So there have been 6 or 7 cases around the world, I think, where ketamine or its metabolites have been discovered in horses' urine. And in each case where it's been investigated, it has clearly been very low level and inconsequential contamination. One case occurred in Hong Kong, and they subsequently found out that the groom was a ketamine junkie and had been peeing in the stable, and that was clearly the case there. And they found very small levels, and they found they were inconsequential. And we're talking nanogram levels. I did some research into this, and in fact, one paper I found, they investigated it as a human party drug, and they sampled people exiting parties, and they put in a cutoff at 100. In other words, if anybody had less than 100 nanogram, they thought, well, they've just soaked that up at the party. They didn't give themselves ketamine. Whereas if you found 1 nanogram of ketamine in a horse, it would be regarded as a positive drug test. And in each of the cases that I know about, we've been finding these low-level amounts of ketamine or its metabolite, norketamine, at nanogram levels. And in each case, it's quite clear that the horse had either grazed or ingested a byproduct from another horse that had had a general anaesthetic. So it was getting a very, very, very small amount of ketamine, which would be neither detrimental to its welfare or have any effect on performance. So I also found out that the sort of cut-off levels where they would actually call a positive in human workplace health and safety would be many times that as well. So much as we don't want horses racing on general anaesthetics, we need to set the bar somewhere so that we don't... And of course, in each case, these trainers had no real way of knowing that the horse would have that level, or were implicit in it having that level. They certainly didn't administer anything to it. So this comes back to your original talk about levels and cut-offs and so on, and it's one interesting way to illustrate that.
Yeah, because I mean, I just think about it personally when you just read the trainers had a horse test positive to ice, and then they've said they've traced it back to possibly an employee urinating in the box or something like that, and there's always that thought in your mind of, oh yeah, that's not a bad little defence. That, you know, you can sort of say, you know, blame it on an employee when you've gotten a positive, and that's sort of a good way to, I suppose, to try and get away with it. But you don't actually take in consideration how small the test reading actually was in relation to, you know, what's needed as any sort of performance enhancing amount. I mean, if you said that all it takes is just one nanogram or picogram to actually test a positive, then there's sort of, as you said, there just needs to be more education as far as a positive isn't necessarily a positive. There's more to it than that, and it comes down to the size of the reading, not necessarily the fact it's either you know, green or red sort of thing. You know, it's either clear or not.
Yeah, I think there's by my read of it, there's to me an anomaly in the rules of racing, and I think if you look at the current rules of racing, a licensed person, which actually includes a veterinarian, a strapper, a jockey, they can... Are you still there?
Yeah, sorry about that. My computer just said my charger was not plugged in. I forgot to turn on.
Oh, that's all right.
Quickly duck there for 2 seconds. Yeah. Sorry about that.
That's fine. No, I'll come back to where I started. So, to my read of it, correct me if I'm wrong, and you have a look yourself. If we read the rules of racing, they actually stipulate in the rules of racing levels which are considered to be a prohibited substance in licensed persons, which includes jockeys, strappers, trainers, and in fact veterinarians. And so you're allowed to have a certain level of ice or cannabis or opiates in your system as a licensed person. If that same level was in a horse and it was greater than 0, it would be a prohibited substance. So to my mind, there's a little anomaly there.
Yeah, very true. It's very interesting. I think that's just, I think it's unfortunate for the people that do happen to get a positive with their horses that have done the right thing, that there's not many people, not many members of the public that actually do understand that. And that included myself. I didn't realise, I didn't even think that the tests were that sensitive, that it's either a yes or a no as far as positive or not. And if you're going down into picograms or nanograms, how small that actually is. And it's going to get to the, I mean, it's going to be exceptionally hard not to have a horse test positive to a drug that happens to be in the environment or can be consumed by a human that happens to be working in that stable, if the tests are obviously getting this sensitive. And there isn't going to be a pass threshold implemented for each of these substances as you've just pictured, as there is for humans in the workplace. I mean, it's only going to be pretty much a sure thing that people are going to be getting positives for a lot of different things at these very minute levels.
Yeah, if I could take another case in point, which is on a more positive note, and we've talked earlier about the screening limits. So phenylbutazone, I'm sure you're aware of phenylbutazone. Every trainer knows what phenylbutazone is, and for a long time, the conventional wisdom has been that the withholding time of phenylbutazone is approximately 7 days. And it's also been known for a long time that if they look hard enough, they can detect phenylbutazone at a certain level for perhaps a month. Yet everybody agrees that once you've given a horse a dose of phenylbutazone, it probably only kills pain for a day or maybe 2 days. So you've got a very wide margin between the conventional detection threshold, in fact, the advisory withdrawal time, and when it might be effective. So that's good. And if a horse 8 days out has some painful condition or a swelling, it's nice to know that we can use some. But we don't want to find, there's no great use in finding a trace residue which says the horse had phenylbutazone a month ago. So this has been the status quo for most of my career. However, with the new screening limits, what we've done is we've actually, the authorities have put an actual screening threshold in place, which from memory is 100 nanogram per mil. And that means that if they find less than that, they don't proceed through to confirmation. So now we've got an objective goalpost to work to, and we've got that for a number of common substances like flunixin, some of the sedatives and corticosteroids and so on that we know are quite important in maintaining the horse, the health and welfare of horses. So we've dealt with that issue of minute traces in those substances. It's the ones that haven't got established screening limits, which are either therapeutics without screening limits or these substances which can occur from misadventure or environmental contamination, that I believe are the ones that run the risk for us with these highly sophisticated testing methods.
I suppose, it's also the other thing too. If you will have people that do want to cheat and do want to do the wrong thing, and I suppose if you do make things, you don't want to make things to the point where there's loopholes where people can say that, it's as a result of a staff member, or it's, can put the blame elsewhere, when in actual fact they were just trying their absolute best to get as close as they could to the limits to give their horse every chance, and they just, happen to go too far, or they've actually purposely tried to do the wrong thing and give themselves an edge that wasn't within the bounds of the law, and they've, used possibly a wording or a loophole within threshold limits to trying to get away with something that has been foul play, I suppose. And that does happen.
Yeah, the message there, I would suggest, is that you make sure that there is actually daylight between what might be therapeutically active and what you call the limit of the screening limit, and that's the way they work it. There really is daylight between the level they screen at and what could be useful in a horse. So there's no point trying to basically sort of titrate a drug in to get under the screening limit, because you're going to be miles away from anything useful anyway. That'd be my answer to that. I think it's a legitimate concern, but that'd be my answer. And I think part of the story is actually educating the trainers into realising this, and frankly, from my point of view, getting them to concentrate more on getting the right horses, feeding them, watering them, and training them well, and putting them in races they can win.
Because that's it too. I mean, as you said at the start, there is a lot of, I suppose there's a lot of witchcraft sort of stuff that goes around as far as what pharmaceuticals do actually improve performance, and trainers possibly thinking right or wrong that they can actually get an edge by doing this, when you've sort of alluded to the fact that they're probably very much misinformed as to what would be a performance enhancer, how much you have to give them to be any sort of benefit to their performance, and the fact that there could possibly, their opinion of that might have been swayed by pharmaceutical companies or people sort of looking to push these products, when in actual fact they don't do what's...
Yeah, I think that's very true, and I don't think the industry has done a whole lot to make them think otherwise. And I think a lot of, if you ask me, I think basically most of the trainers that I know want a level playing field, and they want to win races the right way, but a lot of them got an insecurity about the fact that they might be being beaten by somebody that's got some tricks that they don't have. And I think this is a lot of the Cobalt story. And of course, one of the axioms of horse racing is if you win races, you get swabbed. And then when somebody has a bout of winning races and then all of a sudden comes up with a Cobalt positive, the trainers tend to turn around and say, I knew he was onto something, he was doing too well. So it's self-perpetuating to some extent, isn't it? And that's the problem. If you win races, you get swabbed. And if we don't watch out, we all bring racing into disrepute for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, that is so true. You do hear, and I've heard that a fair bit working in the industry, that it's just sort of one of those natural things, isn't it? It's like, geez, he must be on some good stuff then, if they've had a bit of a winning streak or something like that. There's got to be another reason why they're doing well, other than the fact they're doing well. But yeah, it's good to hear from someone who's actually an expert in this area, as far as how far off the mark a lot of these trainers might be, that possibly do think that given these different supplements or given these pharmaceuticals the way they have, isn't actually doing anything much at all in actuality.
I wouldn't like to try to remember how often a trainer's come to me and said, I thought they were cheating till it happened to me. And particularly in the Cobalt situation, I'm not going to name names, but I can't remember how many times somebody has come to me and said, I thought they were cheating till it happened to me. Not just Cobalt, but other substances as well. And that's a natural way for them to think. They got swabbed because they won the race. They got a positive. Well, that's why they won the race.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much for your time, Derek. I won't keep you much longer with your answers, and this conversation has been really insightful for me. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise on this. Really appreciate your time.
What I've done for you, I've emailed you just a few grabs of some of the subject material and a couple of snips and so on. Just peruse them. It might give you some further information. If there's anything that you'd like to get back to me on, please feel free.
I definitely will. Thank you so much for that. I saw those, and I'll definitely have a look at them after I get off this software and talking to you, and have another look at them. And I dare say that want to come back with some more questions about maybe another subject along these lines, I'll definitely give you a call and look to get your expert opinion on that as well, because you've been incredibly insightful. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Excellent, Derek. I'll, if you like, I should be able to send this entire interview over Google file. Do you have Google account?
Fabulous. I've actually got a Google account. Yeah,
I'll upload it onto that, and I'll share the link with you, so you can get access to this as well, and you can see our whole conversation unedited as well. So once again, yeah, thank you for your time, mate.
Thank you. Well, I can send you a link to my Google Drive if that works for you. What's the best way?
Yeah, that could work. I think so. I've only just recently started using it.
And you can just drop it in there. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, fantastic. Excellent.
Great. Thank you. Good to meet you.
Cheers, Derek. Talk to you soon, mate.
All right. Okay.
Bye.